that God describes, okay, in the Bible. So here's just a few maps I want to show to make it kind of easy to understand, okay? So the first one over here is the Egyptian Empire, and I put some time slots when they began and so forth, but it's not all cut and dry from one to the next, because a lot of times they took over a region, or they started their empire at a certain time and took over a region, but they didn't conquer the whole region until who knows, maybe decades later or something like that. So keep that in mind. But I want to point some of these out. That first one is the Egyptian Empire, right? And then later they were conquered or taken over by the Assyrian Empire. Now, this is history. You can just go in history. This isn't, the Bible puts these in order as well, for the most part. But if you just looked up your, regular world history, you would see that these maps and what they encompass are the same, are here. That's where I grabbed them. In other words, this isn't a Bible map, of what happened or nothing like that. In fact, you're hard to get any of this. I don't think any of this stuff is in the Bible, maybe a map of Israel, but just not the map of these empires. Well, they're probably in some study Bibles. But that being said, okay, so that first one is Egypt. Then they were overtaken by the Assyrian Empire. And then next is the Babylonian Empire. Moses and them started over here in the Egyptian Empire. Then, they were freed from Egypt. And then while they roamed the land around in the promised land, the Assyrians they were going to war with them and ended up taking some of them captive at times. And then some of them were taken captive, and then Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire took over this region here. And then after that, like Daniel says, because that occurred in Daniel's time, so he's actually in Babylon, in the Babylonian Empire at that time when he receives those visions. Okay, and then the Lord basically downloads to him the things that are going to happen afterward, the empires that are coming after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. And Daniel actually goes on into the next couple empires, and actually speaks of it, but he's in the Medo-Persian Empire, right, with Cyrus and Darius, and he gives them revelation from God, and he's highly esteemed in all of them. But if you're starting to notice some similarities here in these empires, like some of the same areas have been taken over, some expanded further to the west and some further to the east. After that was the Grecian Empire with Alexander the Great. And then when he passed away, he divided his empire to his 4 generals. And so you see the different divisions of that same empire here, but you see it over here in pieces. Now, this story is still going on, and Daniel's talking about this story. They're not silent years as most people refer to it in the Bible. Actually, God gives him a lot of the history that's going to take place. And the reason is he doesn't give it so much maybe of the surrounding or the other 2 generals, but 2 of them went to war with each other, and they fought it out in this little region right here, and that's where Israel is, if you didn't know. And that's what I want you to see with the whole map, with all these maps, is that it's not the whole world that when God took these beast empires and pointed them out to Daniel, and as in that sense it's in the Bible and it's being pointed out to us, he's talking about this certain area, this specific area, which is Israel. And you see that every succeeding empire still took over that land, that piece of land right here, over here, etc., etc. Now, when the Roman Empire came in, their expanse was more from their area westward as well. So it kind of shifted a little bit, because over here in the Grecian Empire and the others, it was expanding toward the east. And so there's a little bit of a shift. In fact, that was one of the reasons why that empire divided. If you research its history, it got so expansive that eventually they couldn't, it was too big for them. And in fact, when you read Daniel, see, like I said earlier, it was broken in pieces. Okay, so that being said, if you looked at the statue, you could say it was the two legs of that empire. Okay, but here's the point I make here. When it says in Zechariah 2:8, for thus says the Lord of hosts, and he's talking about of Israel and Jerusalem, I think specifically, he says, he sent me after glory to the nations which plunder you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. So when the Lord is talking about these beasts, he's talking about the empires that touched the apple of his eye. Because if you're a historian, you know that there was a lot of wars and different things going on all over the world. You know, we have history from China and Japan, and you know, we got history in parts of India. We got history in North and South America. I mean, there was all kinds of things, but the Lord is focused on those empires that kept coming into his promised land, the land that he gave to Israel. Now, there's some significance to that, not just that God promised it to them, but I think geographically and spiritually, there's a reason for that. Okay, but it's the part of God's focus on that piece of land. So when you want to recognize who the beast is, then you have to look at that piece of land, or that, you know, this part of the world's geography. That's what you would look at. Now, if you looked at it, if you continued on from the Roman Empire, remember it was broken up into pieces. Okay, and I'm just giving you a general history of it. Later, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, some called it the Byzantine Empire. Okay, and that very much outlasted. While overall, like I said, you could technically say the Roman Empire still exists today, only it's in pieces. And in fact, they're trying to reunite it in so many ways. Why? Because it was a satanic empire, plain and simple. In other words, the one that's orchestrating all that, the wars and the taking over the region and all that, is Satan himself, you know, working through people, working through man's dominion. Okay, but it became the Byzantine Empire, which later became the Islamic or Ottoman Turkish Empire. But the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, however you refer to it, was an Islamic empire. In other words, it wasn't just that you know, they were taking over land or something like that. They were doing it in the name of their God. Okay, and that's important to understand. But again, it's that part, that apple of God's eye, that should be the focus. So whenever, if you wanted to try to recognize who the beast is in the book of Revelation, well, there's two basically. There's this seven-headed beast that refers to these empires all existing throughout time, you know, which are all basically backed by Satan. That's his efforts to control man, or, you know, well, we won't get too far into that. But the other thing to keep in mind, and this is something that you know, so many people go off point on this. Okay, is that beast, aside from the beast, which is the false prophet, we won't go there. The beast here, when it refers to the woman, is the beast or the empires that were associated with her, because she had a part in every one of these empires. Remember, she's the one in control. And definitely by the time it's Islamic, I mean, it had a lot of things put together in a systematic way. And that's what I wanted to kind of bring up here. But okay, we're looking at these two, which is still the Roman Empire, right? And it's now if you look in that region, it's an Islamic empire, just to reiterate. So here's the point that I make on that. The beast at this present time is Islam. That would be the main way to recognize who the beast is. Okay, that seven-headed beast at this point in time, the other heads are still a part of it in a historic way and in a united way, we'll elaborate later. But in the main way, the primary head is the Islamic Empire at this point in time. Okay, it's the one that's controlling that region, except for that small part right in there, which is Jerusalem, which is why there's such a conflict in that region as well. Okay, so anything associated with the beast, I'm going to tell you right now, has to be associated with Islam. That's where we start to lose track. And a lot of times, a lot of scholars, and good scholars, and I used to kind of believe this too, but, they end up going to the West and trying to find out who the beast is. And, America's the beast, the British Empire is the beast, and, all these other places that are far more west. But if we did that, then we're not in the apple of God's eye. Okay, the one that has remained in that area, that promised land area, is Islam in present day. Okay, and so that's the beast. And when you look at what Islam is all about, there's no disputing it. They have all the facets of satanic worship working in their system, including military, religious components. I mean, you name it, all the stuff that are satanic, pedophilia. And we'll talk about that later as we go. So this is now, look at these pictures, and I said we're giving you the full spectrum of this, right? This statue right here in the middle, this is a statue. Notice the banner right here. This is the Parliament building, I think is what it's called, for the EU, for United Europe United. Okay, so what is that? It's now, there's a story, and I won't tell you what it is. I can't remember exactly. I'll let you research it. But there's a story here, just like there's a story here, just like there's a story here on this one, of a woman riding a beast. And I think it's Europa, now that I think about it. So you can look that up, and there's a story behind that. But like I said, this is one of those many, say 70 languages of Nimrod or something like that, and where all these stories end up going. This is all part of the labyrinth. But do you think it's a coincidence that they decided to put a statue of a woman on a beast? You could say it's a horse or something like that, but it's still a woman on an animal or a beast, riding it. And that's what they chose to have as their symbol. Now you're going to have to judge those things for yourself, because I know how some of the journey goes, where, we're kind of like, well, I don't know, that kind of seems far-fetched. And it's like, okay, but that's only one other piece. Here's 3 pieces of the puzzle for you right there. Look at what it says here in Revelation when it describes this woman and where she sits. It says, "Then he said to me, the waters which you saw," where the harlot sits. Remember, the harlot's on the beast, but the waters, it says, are what? Peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues, meaning different languages. And see, so it's like the Lord is trying to put it together, or pull it together for you to start to get a bigger, a more accurate picture, rather. It says, "And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot." So if I said the beast, and I'm saying the beast is Islam, but we're studying the harlot. And this is why I wanted to make this short little study on the beast, because you have to, in order to define the harlot, you have to be able to basically disconnect her from the beast to see it more clearly. Otherwise, it gets mixed up. Notice how it says that the 10 horns. Okay, now a horn is usually referred to as, in Daniel especially, as a king of an empire. So if the empire or the kingdom is a beast, the horn on the beast is a specific king or ruler within that empire's history. Okay, now there's 10 horns right here at this time. This is saying that it says they're going to hate the harlot. So if the beast is Islam, and there's these horns, and specifically, I think at this point it's 3, but they're united in their efforts. So you have to consider that. But it says they hate the harlot, and they're going to make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. It says, for God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Now, look at this. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. There's your reference right there. That's the reference to Babel or Babylon. It's calling it a great city. You know, in reality, it was the first city. It was where, instead of going out and obeying God and, you know, going out to the ends of the earth and, you know, having dominion, etc. over it, they congregated together and defied God. Okay. And so that's the city. You know, we're waiting for a city too, in that sense. You know, it says in Revelation, the city, the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven, the place Jesus went to prepare for us, his bride, etc. So there's these tales here. You know, when you see some of their references to a great city, these and you know, whether it's some of their historic stories, their mythology, all these different things that are part of the puzzle. So let's go ahead and look at the next one. Oops. There we go. So it says in 17:5, this lag is killing me here. In 17:5, then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So here's where I'm going to take a little bit of a shift here, because it's all that, it's hard to recognize where she's at. Well, by her sitting on the beast and in these waters is basically saying she has influence or is touching those areas of the earth, you know. So that makes it very difficult or challenging to recognize her. Now the beast is a lot easier, because I just showed you how you know, each succeeding kingdom was in that same area, and that's how you know who he's referring to. But when it comes to the harlot, her influence is greater. Remember, she's influencing the beast. The beast ends up hating her, but her influence is actually getting the whole earth, the kings and the inhabitants of the earth, drunk with her fornication, is what the scripture said. Now, how is she doing that? I put these names here, just a few names to understand some of her, let's say, her minions. The deep state is probably the most popular term that we're using, but the only problem with that is that we tend to think of it as within our own country. These same deep state operatives that are you know, plotting and conspiring to overthrow our government, our president, etc., they're the same ones in conspiracy, conspiring to do it and have done it all over the world. And you could basically say every place where there's some kind of division in the country or something like that, you have these deep state operatives working, because their loyalty isn't to their country, and they're not necessarily trying to take over a country to have that country, as they are trying to have the country and bring it in under a one world government or system, you know. And that's, you know, so that's something that they're ultimately after. But here's some other names. The Illuminati, I like using that one. We're talking about the same people, but maybe a little bit of their different workings. Usually when I talk about the Illuminati, talking a little bit more about their occultic practices, where the deep state would be a little bit more of their governmental practices. Okay. Illuminati is a popular term in the entertainment industry. So I was originally, when I did this series years ago, I was naming it the Illuminati, but the word deep state didn't exist in the mainstream back then. So even though I've heard the reference, it wasn't very popular. What I really, if I wanted to refer to them, I would just call them Satanists, because that's who they're serving. Okay. But the ones that do it knowingly, they actually consider themselves Luciferians. And so that's something that is pretty abominable, because what they're basically saying, instead of calling him Satan and calling him Lucifer, is that he's still an angel of light, and that God is basically the bad father that doesn't want, that's kind of like trying to spoil the enlightenment of mankind. But Lucifer wants to bring light, which is just an outright blasphemous lie. Okay. But another popular term, and this one is really something to consider, is secret societies. Maybe in the past more referred to as cabals. Okay. Groups of people that are associating with each other, that have loyalties to one another, and that are in secret doing things in order to attain certain outcomes, etc. They have goals, in other words. The most popular one is Freemasonry here in our country, and probably around the world too.